In chapter 4 of The Witch Cult in Western Europe, Margaret Murray writes, "There were two kinds of assemblies. The one, known as the Sabbath, was the general meeting of all the members of the religion. The other, to which I give, on the authority of Esteban de Cambrew, the name of Esbat, was only for the special and limited number who carried out the rites and practices of the cult, and was not for the general public." Now, Murray goes on to give a little bit of etymology for the word Sabbath. And interestingly, she derives the word from French sabbatre, which means to frolic, to have fun, to enjoy oneself. And this is a little bit unusual because most etymologists today would say that the word Sabbath, which was previously Sabbat, but the H was applied from about the 14th to 16th centuries. People started spelling it with an H on the end. Sabbat or Sabbath would have come from the Latin sabbatum, but according to Murray, she draws it from the Latin ebatuo, which I believe is linked to the word battle, but there were two different types of battle. There was the battle to hurt somebody, and then there was more of a battle in the sense of play fighting, having fun with someone. So you could also say that maybe the word Sabbat is linked to a battle, night battles against spirits, or it could be a battle in terms of a game, a playful kind of fighting, and then again it could be from the sabbatum, which is the day of rest, which comes from the Sumerian Sabbat, which means mid-rest. And according to Marcello Craveri, it was almost certainly derived from the Babylonian Shabbatu, which is the festival of the full moon. As the Enuma Elish reads, "Sabbath shalt thou then encounter mid-monthly." So whether you derive this word Sabbath, Sabbat, from sabbatum or from ebatuo, two different Latin words, I think, you could interpret it as a night battle. You could interpret it as a frolicking, having fun, or you could interpret it as a day of rest, or as a middle of the month full moon celebration. So I'm a little bit confused about the words that Murray is using, Sabbath and Esbat, for two different types of meeting, because it sounds like she believes that they both have the same etymology from Old French, or maybe the two have different etymologies. Maybe the Esbat is specifically from Old French to frolic, and then the Sabbath is the monthly meeting of the full moon, or the day of rest. It's very confusing, but basically she explains that the Sabbath is a public ritual of the seasonal changes, and she speaks about 6 ritual times of year that are celebrated as Sabbaths, and she describes them as the 4 turnings of the seasons in the Celtic calendar, which are Imbolc, Beltane, Lunasa and Samhain. And then the solstices. She says that they didn't recognise the equinoxes, but then so she says that there's this ritual year of the 4 main festivals being the turning of the seasons, and then the solstices being added to that. And then the Esbats she describes as meetings that could happen on a regular basis, like weekly or fortnightly or monthly or whenever, because it's basically a practical gathering for the purpose of operative witchcraft, of casting spells. But also she says it wasn't necessarily for casting spells, because it could also be just for the sake of meeting up and having fun. So she says, according to the records that she's looking at, that people might meet up just to have a drink and a chat and a dance and sing songs and make merry. But the main difference between the Esbat and the Sabbat, according to her, is that the Esbat is for the local group of witches to meet up for a private meeting, and that the Sabbat is a larger event, so that's why it's less frequent, 4 or 6 times a year, and that was more of a ritual celebration of nature, of the old gods, an event for rites of passage, for initiations, for baptizing, for weddings, for all kinds of big events. The Sabbats were the big rituals, and then the Esbats were the smaller sort of gatherings for whatever reason that the witches wanted to come together for. The exact order of the ceremonies is never given and probably varied in different localities, but the general rule of the ritual at the Sabbath seems to have been that proceedings began by the worshippers paying homage to the devil, who sat or stood in a convenient place. The homage consisted in renewing the vows of fidelity and obedience, in kissing the devil on any part of his person that he chose to indicate, and sometimes in turning a certain number of times widdershins. Then followed the reports of all magic worked since the previous Sabbath, either by individuals or at the Esbats, and at the same time the witches consulted the master as to their cases and received instructions from him how to proceed, after which came admissions to the society or marriages of the members. This ended the business part of the meeting. Immediately after all the business was transacted, the religious service was celebrated, the ceremonial of which varied according to the season of the year, and it was followed by the obscene fertility rites. The whole ceremony ended with feasting and dancing, and the assembly broke up at dawn. This was apparently the usual course of the ritual of the Sabbath. The Esbat had less ceremonial, and the religious service was not performed. The devil himself often went round and collected the congregation, and, not being in his grand array, he appeared as a man in ordinary dress. Instead of the religious service with the adoration of the god, the witches worked the spells and charms with which they bewitched or unbewitched their enemies and friends. Or they exercised new methods which they learnt from their master, or received instructions how to practice the arts of healing and secret poisoning, of causing and blasting fertility. In some places the witches saluted their chief by falling on their knees, and also by certain manual gestures. In other places by curtsies and obeisances. In Scotland, France and Belgium, another rite was also in vogue, that of kissing the devil on any part of his person that he might direct. At Como and Brescia, the witches, when they paid reverence to the presiding demon, bent themselves backwards, lifting a foot in the air forwards. In Somerset, 1664, the witches always mention the salutation. At their first meeting, the man in black bids them welcome, and they all make low obeisances to him. In 1610, Magdalene de Demondel gave a detailed account of the homage rendered by the witches. First, the hags and witches, who are people of a sordid and base condition, are the first that come to adore the prince of the synagogue, who is Lucifer's lieutenant, and he that now holdeth that place is Louis Godfrey. Then they adore the princess of the synagogue, who is a woman placed at his right hand. Next they go and worship the devil, who is seated in a throne like a prince. In the second place come the sorcerers and sorceresses, who are people of a middle condition, and these perform the same kind of adoration with the former, kneeling upon the ground, but not prostrating themselves as do the other, although they kiss the hands and feet of the devil, as the first likewise do. In the third place come the magicians, who are gentlemen and people of a higher rank. Dances, as an important part of fertility rites, are too well known to need description. The witches' dances, taken in conjunction with the dates of the 4 great Sabbats of the year, point to the fact that they also were intended to promote fertility. There were several forms of ritual dances, varying apparently according to the form of fertility required, whether of crops, animals, or human beings. The jumping dance seems to have had for its object the growth of the crops. The higher the performers jumped, the higher the crops would grow. The so-called obscene or indecent dance was for the promotion of fertility among animals and women. When the dancers were disguised as animals, the dance was for the increase of the animals represented, when undisguised for the fertility of human beings. Although the dances took place at English witch meetings, they are merely mentioned and not described. The Scotch trials give rather fuller accounts, but the chief details are from France. The 2 principal forms of the dance were the ring dance and the follow my leader dance. But there was also a very complicated form which was not understood by the inquisitors, who therefore dismiss it with the words tout est en confusion. It still survives, however, in the Basses Pyrenees, in some of the very villages which were inhabited by witches in the 16th century, those witches whose proceedings de l'Ancre describes so vividly. Vocal music was also heard at the meetings, sometimes as an accompaniment of the dance, sometimes as an entertainment in itself. When it was sung as part of the dance, the words were usually addressed to the master, and took the form of a hymn of praise. Such a hymn addressed to the god of fertility would be full of allusions and words to shock the sensibilities of the Christian priests and ministers who sat in judgment on the witches. The feast, like the rest of the ritual, varied in detail in different places. It took place either indoors or out according to the climate and the season. In southern France, almost invariably in the open air. In Scotland and Sweden, almost always under cover. In England, sometimes one, sometimes the other. Where it was usual to have it in the open, tables were carried out and the food laid upon them. Indoor feasts were always spread on tables, but in the English accounts of the open-air meal, the cloth was spread, picnic fashion, on the ground. The food was supplied in different ways, sometimes entirely by the devil, sometimes entirely by one member of the community, and sometimes picnic fashion again, all the company brought their own provisions. Consequently, the quality of the food varied considerably. On some occasions it was very good, on others very homely. But no matter who provided it, the thanks of the feasters were solemnly and reverently given to the master, to whose power the production of all food was due. The Somerset trials give more detail than any of the other English cases. Elizabeth Style said that at their meeting they usually have wine or good beer, cakes, meat, or the like. They eat and drink really when they meet in their bodies, dance also and have music. The man in black sits at the higher end, and Anne Bishop usually next to him. He useth some words before meat, and none after. His voice is audible but very low. They had wine, cakes, and roast meat, all brought by the man in black, which they did eat and drink. They danced and were merry, and were bodily there, and in their clothes. Alice Duke gave a similar account. All sat down, a white cloth being spread on the ground, and did drink wine and eat cakes and meat. At first sight it would seem that the candles were naturally used only to illuminate the midnight festivities, but the evidence points to the burning lights being part of the ritual. This is also suggested by the importance in the cult of the early spring festival of Candlemas, a festival which has long been recognised as of pre-Christian origin. The light is particularly mentioned in many instances as being carried by the devil, usually on his head. The witches often lit their torches and candles at this flame, though sometimes it seems that the devil lit the torch and then presented it to the witch. To call the chief of the cult Lucifer was therefore peculiarly appropriate, especially at the Candlemas Sabbath. The earliest example of the religious services occurs in 1324, in the trial of Lady Alice Keitler. In rifling the closet of the lady, they found a wafer of sacramental bread, having the devil's name stamped thereon instead of Jesus Christ. According to Bogart in 1589, the devil did not always perform the religious service himself, but Mass was celebrated by a priest among his followers. This custom is found in all countries and seems to have been as common as that the devil himself should perform the service. At Aix in 1610, Magdalene de Mandel said that the accursed magician Luz did first invent the saying of Mass at the Sabbaths, and did really consecrate and present the sacrifice to Lucifer. She also related that the said magician did sprinkle the consecrated wine upon all the company, at which time everyone crieth, Sangue eus super nos and filios nosotros. Fountainhall, in writing of the same convention of witches, says that the devil adventured to give them the communion or holy sacrament. The bread was like wafers, the drink was sometimes blood, sometimes black moss water. He preached and most blasphemously mocked them, if they offered a trust in God who left them miserable in the world, and neither he nor his Son Jesus Christ ever appeared to them when they called on them, as he had who would not cheat them.